Greg, how can someone tell if they're a mouth breather or not?
I think there's a few ways. I think for parents, I think one of the best things is to pay attention to your child because I think very much so. I think it starts as a kid might be nasal breathing, and then basically they might get on their back, or when they start to sleep, you might start to realize that like they're getting to deeper levels of sleep. And this is often where we lack the ability to nasal breathe. So I think early on, it's really important to check your kid. You should not hear teeth grinding, snoring. Those are not normal things. So then I would always just tell parents, you've got to be on defense all the time, but at the same time, like, not being crazy about it. But I think just realizing it could become a thing. And when it does, to try to take action as soon as possible to limit it becoming a habit. But I think an easy way a lot of times is if someone can't get their tongue up on their palate, whether they have a tongue tie or this and that, you should be able to. If I put my tongue on my palate, swallow a few times, and plug my nose, I shouldn't be able to breathe. So there's a number of different ways. And then I think there's a lot of people that are hybrid breathers, meaning they kind of go back and forth all day long. Like my business partner, I would say, is like a big person as far as like his airway is good size, his posture, all those things. But maybe during allergy season, like even for him, like mouth taping really helps him during allergy season, or something where the minute he has beer or cheese at nighttime, it can be enough to where he's going to mouth breathe and he's going to wake up with a dry mouth. So I think there's different levels to it. There's those like myself that literally I just mouth breathe all the time every day for my entire life. And then there's those that whether they are transitioning because they're not developing properly, or those that have developed properly, and this is where like allergies, environment, all these things can kind of come in, that like people can kind of check their kids or themselves just to kind of bring some accountability.
Okay, yeah. So I like the what you described with putting tongue on the roof of your mouth and swallowing a few times and then plug your nose and can you breathe or not. That's a nice test because what a lot of people don't realize they're mouth breathing. And then to your point, if that continues for years or decades, you start to find out because you have all these symptoms and no one can explain them. And you're reading your 10th book in a different area of health and then start to come across the airway or the jaw. So obviously finding that out 10 years earlier or at a younger age is going to be really, really valuable. So would you say that's a good at home test? And then is again just looking for ideas of before it gets to a symptom or health issue. What are other things people can look at if it's not mouth breathing? Maybe it's palate palate size or something like that.
I would say the number one thing, it's called a four-phase rhino manometer that basically ENTs, dentists will have, that they can literally hook you up and measure. And they can look on a three-dimensional axis to look at left side, right side, and the flow. And it can basically break down your entire structure from a nasal resistance to let people know whether they're at risk, they're not breathing well, or they're fine from a function perspective. But like the best way to quantify it would be with a rhinomanometer because it can let people know. Because it's like, do you want to be the person that's on the cusp of almost mouth breathing, but you're good to go? Or do you want to know you're in the clear? And I think oftentimes it's a lot of people don't measure pre and post treatment. And therefore, everyone's just guessing. And it's like, if you're not measuring it, you don't know for sure. And this is where I said in science, it's not about the measurement, it's about the flow of air. And physics is dictated in a lot of different ways. So, therefore, it can't be quantified by a measurement. It has to be measured. And this is where a device that can look at that can tell whether someone age related, sex, all that is where they need to be or not.
Yeah, I mean that's super valuable. Again, earlier on before symptoms start to push the narrative. How about a 3D cone beam scan or anything that gives you a picture of the size of the back airway.
So this is pretty interesting. So Dr. Koppelson, he's the guy at the Breathe Institute that did the mind procedure. And what he showed was, this is something I understand from a training perspective. If people don't have a standard as far as how they put someone sitting in a cone beam, the measurement can be all over the place. Because if someone doesn't have good grounding underneath their head, where the spine is, whether they're coached to put the tongue on the roof of the mouth or not, like all these things can dramatically change how someone sees what's in front of them. And he even talks about how the minute my head literally just kind of leans back just a little bit, so for every 5 degrees from a cephalometric perspective, I'm going to increase my airway dramatically. So oftentimes, where we tend to be from a postural perspective is just a biased way for us to breathe better because we lack the ability to do so efficiently with what we have. So then it becomes this whole, you can't compare apples to apples unless everything is kind of done the same way. And this is what's huge with cone beam, I would say, is that people, they're not coached, those putting people in a machine. And it's like, if it's not standardized from practice A to practice B, you can't comparatively even talk about it in studies because there's all this bias already in the study if someone doesn't account for that. And like, this is how I look at studies now. It's like, well, they talk about health in America. And I'm like, well, if 56% of these people in this study are mouth breathers, I don't care about their data because they're already not healthy.
Right. Yeah. Body's already stressed. Like we've talked about, the nervous system's likely out of whack and there's a stress load on the body. Yeah. But that's an interesting point about the cone beam scam because a lot of times, I mean, versus going to like a world class specialist, like you're very knowledgeable about and often refer people to, versus maybe the standard one, even in a standard biological dentist office. Because the ones I've done, it's their staff is doing it, and they have definitely different levels of training from someone who seems very highly trained and competent to someone who it's you could tell it's they're still in their first year at the office and they're following the instructions they were told, but I doubt it's as precise as what you're describing.
Yeah, and it was interesting to hear him say that. So I think there's like landmarks when it comes to like teeth. You can look at like the sinuses. There's a lot of great data you can get from a cone beam. So I'm not saying that, but it's more of a, I think this is where you get into issues because you can have an ortho and a facial surgeon that have two opinions. And then if you have cone beams taken at each and it's not done the same way, it's like the two doctors aren't even talking about the same thing because the person has changed relative to their data based on how it was captured. And this is like, people don't like, we're talking millimeters, but millimeters mean everything in the airway. And this is like from a spine posture, all those things. And this is where it's like hard to weed through the good versus the bad data in airway because it's like relative to those taking it and how it's talked about that it's like, okay, this was done well versus
Yeah, there's clearly a lot of nuance and clearly even within that nuance, judgment that needs to be made by both the practitioner and the patient. So appreciate you coming on and sharing a bit more in detail with us.
yeah, man, thanks for having me.